Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series. My name is Suzanne Miller, and I'm a principal researcher in the SEI Software Solutions Division. Today, I am joined by my colleagues and friends, Bill Nichols and Julie Cohen. They are also members of the Software Solutions Division. Today, we're here to talk about their recent work looking at actionable data that can be pulled from the DevSecOps pipeline. Welcome, Julie and Bill.
Well, thank you.
Hi, Sue.
Glad to be here.
So this is going to be a fun topic, but before we get into that topic, let's begin by having you tell us a little bit about yourselves, what brought you to the SEI, and the work you do here, what's cool about it. Julie, you're new to our podcast series, so why don't we have you start?
So my name's Julie Cohen. I've been at the SEI about 20 years now. Before that, I was in the Air Force for 20 years as an engineer and a program manager with a lot of different jobs. When I left the Air Force, I had a couple of jobs in industry, and then I joined the SEI, where I've worked space programs and non-space programs, acquisition, engineering. It's been a good ride.
What's the most fun about what you do?
Actually helping the customers, seeing the customers struggling with something, helping them to see different options, and then watching them pick a good option and move forward.
I could have predicted that answer. I've known you for a while. We both have that same sensibility. Bill, tell our audience about yourself, those that have not run into you before, and same thing. What's cool about what you do here?
Okay, well, my background is experimental particle physics. That's where I actually got my PhD. But I spent the next 15 years or so working at a naval nuclear lab doing the programming for scientific and engineering design and analysis tools. So I wrote things that were used to design the next generation nuclear reactors, to build simulators, and so forth. As we went into not only developing but modernizing that, we got really involved in modernizing a large suite of analysis software, and that's how I got into software project management. And it was also a good exposure to some of the needs of the Navy as far as being able to meet certain types of schedule demands. For example, you had to have simulators ready for your crew to train on, and the software better be ready for that. And you had to have the onboard software ready for the crew when you're ready to launch the boat. The schedules really did matter. Not as much maybe if you're NASA and you have to meet a launch window, because it's going to be a couple of years before you can go to Mars again. But the schedules were important. Well, we worked with one of the teams from the Software Engineering Institute on how to do some of this program planning. And that's how I really got into it. And after a few years, I actually came to the SEI to learn a little more about that and to share what I was learning with other people, and to find out what others in the world were doing, to see this from a broader perspective. So I've been with the SEI now since about 2006. So it's been essentially half of my working career. What I find most interesting is, I really get excited when I get a hold of the data and can try to make sense of it, understand what it means, think about how you can improve the process or make predictions. It's like, wow, they actually pay me to solve these puzzles.
Yes, you are a puzzle solver, and I think all of us are in different ways. But I want to sort of move us then into talking about DevSecOps. And just before we get into your topic, I want to remind our audience members, especially those that are new, that the SEI has lots of resources, including podcasts that will provide you with an overview of DevSecOps. We have things from the continuous development deployment of capability directorate. We have things from CERT. We have things from your group. So we have lots and lots of things. And so we're not going to go into an overview of what is DevSecOps here. We'll have links in our transcript to all kinds of good resources. But I do want to talk about how DevSecOps has changed the game when we are talking about the challenges that programs face, and why automation is so much more important today than it might have been 20 years ago or 15 years ago
Mm.
when you were doing, some of the analysis that you were doing in the past. So I don't know who wants to take that one first, but
Well, let me take a couple of things on this one. First of all, DevSecOps is all about continuous integration, continuous deployment. Infrastructure as code, automation of tests and builds and deployment. Everything is automated. So if you can automate these things, it means you have to be able to describe your workflows and your process with a fairly high amount of precision, which is what I've been advocating for years. But there was always this resistance in the software community to doing that. But there's also been that counter tendency of people love the tools. They want the tools to help them. Well, DevSecOps, the tools are doing a lot of that manual work with pushing things through deployment, uh, managing the system. And what's really changed with this level of automation is the precision with which you can actually describe your workflow and your work process. And that provides a lot of opportunities for measurement. Now, the challenge is because things are coming through continuously, you're doing this continuous integration, continuous deployment, you have this constant stream of data. So just keeping up with the data becomes a challenge. But everything is being driven by tools. Well, the tools should be able to help you automate that data collection. That presents another set of problems, but the tools then, which are enabling this fast, rapid development, also provide you an opportunity to measure what is, in effect, a precisely defined workflow. And that's what's really changed the game in the last few years. This realization that we do have a repeatable, prescriptive type of process that we can measure and evaluate.
and I know some of the work that you did earlier, that resistance to defining a process in precise ways that can be measured. I know from the work that I did in that time frame, a lot of that resistance came from, if I define it, then somebody's going to want me to collect measures for it, and the collection of measures in that time frame was not automated. I remember us having screen things in the upper left hand corner just to record time, stop and start timers and things like that were actually intrusive to the flow of the work, which is one of the reasons that we would see some of that resistance. So the fact that we are 15, 20 years later able to make process measurement low drag is something that's not just significant for the developers, because I'm going to go to Julie now. The managers have always wanted to be able to have the kind of insight that we now can have, because we are able to collect the data systematically. Because when we're collecting it manually, it's not systematic. I'll raise my hand as saying, I've tried several times in different settings to collect data manually, and I wouldn't pass my polygraph if I were to assert that I consistently collected my data. We're humans, right? So tell me, Julie, about what is it that the program managers that you work with in the acquisition settings, what is exciting about being able to get this work for that role in the development process?
So I think one of the things that's probably the most exciting is having more access to real-time data, or at least near real-time data. For those of you who have dealt with earned value management in the past, right, you get a report that ended the end of the month, but you don't get that report until the end of the next month. And so by the time you get it, the data is almost 60 days late in some cases. Very hard to manage with data that's that late. Even a regular cost report can be very late. And so while you may not get precise cost data from the DevSecOps pipeline, you can certainly see effort and how much effort is being expended and those types of things in near real time. Certainly your schedule information is much more real time, and you can see what was planned and then what was actually accomplished in much closer to the time when it's being done. And so if problems start to pop up, you know much sooner. And that was always the premise of earned value anyway, was that once you start to get behind, you can never catch up. So the earlier you know that you're behind, the better off you are. And now you can probably find that out even earlier. Same thing with product performance. You can see those tests, and you can and as far as risk goes, you're lowering risk because you're automating those tests. You're redoing those regression tests with every build. And so that lowers your overall risk as well. So those are some of the things that the program managers really will benefit from.
And we've all been in the position of having that data that has a time lag to it that makes it, I won't say useless, but you certainly can't take the actions that you would want to take. If I'd have known this 2 months ago, I would have made a different decision. And that's, I think, to my mind, that's what it comes down to, is enabling program managers and acquisition people in different roles to make better decisions. If they have real data that's near real time, that they have faith in, then they can make decisions more confidently, and they're going to make better decisions. Now, all of this, of course, depends on tooling, right? And I think that one of the challenges I've run into in areas where we're trying to use DevSecOps in productive ways, both for developers, testers, and managers, is that not all tooling is created equal. And oh, by the way, the tooling that the development contractor has, and the tooling that the test lab has, and the tooling that the government oversight groups have are not always the same and not always compatible. So can we talk a little bit about sort of what are some of the key tools and types of data, and are there any insights that you've seen, that you've had in terms of, if you could just make this piece of the pipeline the same tool, that would make so much difference. I don't care about all these others, we're never going to get everybody on the same tool. There is not one tool to rule them all. But, if we could at least get this kind of tool compatible, if not the same, then things would be much easier. I don't know. Bill, did you want to take that one? You're smiling.
Well, let's look at it from this point of view. The specific tool doesn't matter so much as long as you have the right interface to get the kind of information from this tool that you really want. So whether you're using the open source version of Jenkins or one of the proprietaries, the question is, what information do you really need to collect? And I think the biggest rookie mistake in most of these efforts is they start off with, hey, what can we measure? And that's always the wrong thing to do for a variety of reasons. But I think the biggest is you end up measuring a lot of things that you just can't use. And the second problem is not only have you measured a bunch of things that you can't use, but you've almost certainly missed measuring something that you needed in order to make the measurements you did take useful. So one of the things that we've been finding is that you can get a lot of great information from these tools. Like the Jenkins is going to be able to tell you things about whether the builds were successful, when you push these things into deployment. From your Git lab or whatever revision control, you can tell things like how many interfaces were changed or how many files were touched, what went into a specific build. But what did they build? You just know that a certain amount of code went into a build, it passed some tests, it went into production. Okay, what went into production? How does that advance my project? Unless you are thinking ahead to some of the problems, like how am I going to tie this into the overall workflow with something like what's going on with my GitLab or my Jira? What are the tickets? How do the tickets roll up into features? And those features, how do they roll up into capabilities? If you haven't connected those different pieces, you're just getting a bunch of point information that isn't really going to be helpful for the programmatics. It reminds me of one of those old jokes. Here's a partial score, Stanford 24.
And I was kind of reflecting that perspective that I hear a lot. Can't we just all have one tool, or can't we have this tool? But I really appreciate your point that in today's world, it's about the interfaces. We've made so many strides in essentially externalizing interfaces so that it is feasible for us to have compatible interfaces across lots of different tool sets. That should not, the lack of sameness in the tool chain should not be a barrier to us being able to get the data we need. But it means, as you said, we've got to think about what is the data that we need. Now I want to sort of go to Julie and say, what are some of the types of data that program managers need at various points throughout the software development lifecycle that our audience may not be aware of as being valuable, that we can pull from these kinds of DevSecOps environments?
Right. So probably one of the best things is schedule type of information, where, again, you've planned work, you know what you've planned for that sprint or that increment, And you can now see very clearly what's getting done and what isn't getting done. And so if work isn't getting accomplished, if there's a capability that is having problems and lagging, in the next increment or the next sprint, depending on how you're running your program, do you want to prioritize something else and think about that capability a little bit more and what's needed? Another thing is quality, right? You can run code checking tools that can help keep track of quality, so that perhaps you're getting less technical debt from the day that you deploy. There's always some technical debt, but if you're checking your code regularly, then you could be more clear about what the quality in that code is. Same thing with cybersecurity, right? That is becoming more and more of an issue, and these automated tools can help you get a handle on just where you are with cybersecurity and where your risks might be. The other thing that it helps you look at is stability, right? Do you have a stable process? Do you have a stable pipeline? Is your flow good? Are you meeting your velocity on a regular basis? Those types of things. Are things working well? Because if you've got a pipeline that is fluctuating up and down and it's always something different, then you probably need to do something. So some of these early indicators, maybe not for the program lead, but for a manager who's involved in the software development, they can get some very good metrics quickly enough to enable them to make some changes if they're needed.
So I'm going to go on both the points that you both just made. I do want to remind our viewers, and especially Bill Nichols, both of you are involved in this work. We do have a set of techniques called GQIM, goal, question, indicator, metric, that are actually designed to help you figure out what are the things that we really want to know about. And we can get into timings, we can get into fidelity, but I think that point of just because you can measure doesn't mean you should, right? Because even with automation, it costs money to gather data. As you were saying earlier, Bill, it takes time and effort to manage the data, to keep it fresh, to understand what is stale, what is not stale, and what is relevant, what is not relevant. So, there's a whole system of measurement and analysis that you need to deal with. SEMA is Software Engineering Measurement Analysis. That's the group that Bill works in. There's a whole lot of things that go into this besides just having access to the data. So to that point, Bill, maybe, Bill and then Julie, what are parts of the system's life cycle where data captured from DevSecOps pipelines, you would say, you know what, maybe that's useful for some niche over here, but it's not going to be generally useful data, especially to the management? Are there some types of data like that you want to highlight to our audience?
Well, I think from a program management standpoint, the kinds of things you're most interested in are things like what are the costs and what is the actual buildup. So a manager shouldn't care about the story points. How many story points are you getting? The velocity, totally useless. What you want to know is how is this burning down my product increment backlog? And what we're finding is even among the organizations that really have their act together, that are running pretty decent pipelines, they'll get into the situation, they'll be 2 months into their 3-month product increment, and they still don't know if they're going to get all their features in. Well, that shouldn't happen. But that happens because they haven't thought ahead of time what it is they need to measure. They're so focused on individual atomic things like story lead times that they've forgotten how are they actually accomplishing? How are they aggregating these things? How are they aggregating to the actual work? And the other problem is you've got to deal with this between teams. A lot of the work, a lot of the measurement that we're doing in the Agile world is idiosyncratic to a specific team. And you have to have certain ways of normalizing that work. And unless you've put some thought up front into what you think these different components are going to cost, you have no basis for comparisons.
Right.
So that's one of the things that we are definitely finding, that there hasn't been a lot of thought to how you do some of these upfront estimates, how you trace these through the system, how you update the estimates, because you're going to get different estimates when you start going through the development pipeline, and you get the bottom up estimates as opposed to management's top down. You've got to be able to track those. And you better not be throwing these just into any old data lake, because I'm from the school that says you really have to think about what you're measuring. Because if you have to solve that puzzle afterward, that's going to be a real heavy lift. And if you want real time data, well, that's not what data lakes are for. Those are for handing it off to some researcher who has grad students and time on his hands.
And,
If you want an answer today, you better know what that data is.
And I tend to, most of the data lakes I run into are really data swamps, because they take you down, they suck you in, and you end up trying to deal with data that you end up saying, why did I do that? That's not
Yeah,
right.
I call that the software analysis measurement pool.
Yeah.
The swamp.
Oh. Very good. Very good. Julie, are there any particular types of data that you've run into where you go, oh, please don't collect that. That's just not going to give you any help at all?
Well, I think Bill hit the nail on the head with, lower level velocity and day-to-day types of things. One of the things I will say, though, about the research that Bill is doing that's really important is looking at multiple pipelines. So if you have a big project, chances are that you have more than one pipeline, and that things that are on pipeline 1 may need to interface with something that's on pipeline 2, and there's a date where one set of work is needed to enable the other set of work. And so being able to look at information across the pipelines to know how that integration is going to happen is really vitally important. We know that integrating software is important to do early and often.
Yep.
DevSecOps in general helps that tremendously. But if you have more than one pipeline, you need to understand what data is in each one and how they're going to come together. So how is that work progressing in each of those at a top level is very, very important to the program manager.
And I don't know about your experience, but my experience when you have that multiple pipeline situation is that everyone is, you get this local optimization, right, versus systemic optimization. Everybody's trying to optimize how the workflow and the measurement and everything works in their pipeline, and it's easy for them to forget about who they need to integrate with and look at, I may need to slow down a little bit because I'm not really going to get a chance to even integrate with this other piece, until this other time period. Maybe I need to be working on something else while they're catching up, to where we are. So this is very reminiscent of how we were dealing with, manual processes, right, in the 80s of who's catching up to whom and when are we going to integrate and where are we going to integrate, but we were doing it from a manual viewpoint. And so in some ways we had more time because it took longer to get to an integration point, and we weren't as fixed on incremental, iterative, fast iterations of small batches. We were doing, sort of larger components. So you had actually a little bit of slack a lot of times to get to that point. What we're seeing, I think, here is we're moving fast enough that those integration disconnects are immediately visible. And it behooves us to look at that whole system of pipelines. Is that the direction that your work is going, Bill? Because I have to ask you the question. What are you going to do after you sort of publish the things you're working on now?
Well, there certainly is some of that, but let me take what you've been suggesting and build on it a little. You're probably familiar with the way they recommend doing things in scaled agile framework.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they use the release train metaphor. Basically, all of these pipelines are going flat out, and whatever's ready, you integrate and you put on, and that's fine. That's actually the way you should be doing most things as far as you can. But in our world, the DoD, where you've got these different contractors, there are going to be dependencies in those integrations. And you can't just make those go away by waving your hands. And that is where this problem really comes in. That's why this multiple pipeline and the dependencies is especially a problem in the DoD world where you have real products that are coming together, and you better have all of them, or the warfighter is not going to be properly equipped for the adversary. It's very different than you get in a lot of the commercial spaces. So I think that's why it hasn't been addressed previously, because it's just not a problem that is as widespread in the commercial world. Now, the kinds of things that I'm interested in looking at is extending more of this work in digital engineering. The digital engineering world is really exploding, but they're running into all of these other growing pains. They've got all of these issues with the different portions of the work cycle don't work with the next, that they don't have the proper interfaces between them, and they haven't caught up with how does this affect your workflows. Which reminds me, another thing that we could have touched on in the tooling discussion is, well, even if you don't have the same, even if you have a lot of flexibility in the tools, even if you go back and say we're going to use the same tools, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be using the same workflows
Right.
or using the same kind of accounting systems in the workflows.
Sure.
So you have to think through those issues, how you're going to do the accounting, and that comes back again to our GQIM discussion. What are your information needs? It really helps to think ahead of time. What information am I going to need to make decisions? And that should inform not only how I instrument my process, but how I do the bookkeeping, the accounting, and the analysis in order to get the information I need from it. So I think that's going to be I think that's going to be very interesting for at least the next decade as we continue to move into the digital engineering world, and more of the work is going to be represented in these digital artifacts.
And I smiled when you mentioned that, because that is one of the areas that the Agile transformation team is very active in right now, in terms of understanding how does digital engineering within an Agile development process, and how do we apply Agile within digital engineering to get better results, get small batch, et cetera, out of that. So this is definitely an area that's active, and measurement, as you know, is one of it's like the last thing people want to talk about. They want to talk about, how do I get something, and that tends to be so we have to nudge people in a good direction. Julie, what's next for you in relationship to this work? What's the things that you're hoping to achieve as you move forward with this work?
So I'm really looking forward to the piloting phase, where we hope to actually use this on some programs, and looking at what kind of dashboards are available, and showing those to PMs, both of the programs that we're working with and other programs, to say, what could you do with this data if you had a dashboard like this, and what would you rather see, and what data is most useful to you in this type of an environment, and getting some really good feedback as to how well this can help the program managers.
And I take Bill's point about, it's not just having the same tools and even the workflows, but doing your accounting and bookkeeping the same way. I can't even tell you, Julie, you and I both run into this, where we think we're getting hours. We think we're getting effort hours, and we're really getting calendar hours. And it's like, well, that doesn't help me. That doesn't tell me what it takes to build this. It just tells me how long it's in the cycle. And, something as simple as that can just completely throw off your analysis. So I feel like we're in a back to the future kind of place, because certainly 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion, PSSM, practical software measurement, trying to get people to get clarity on defining what your measures are. The SEI's work in the mid 90s on trying to get clarity. I mean, the things that we did, all these templates full of, here's all the data that you need to understand, is my data the same as your data? We're coming back around to it. But whereas before, people would look at that stuff and go, oh dear, if I do this, then that's just going to be so much work for me to gather and figure out, and how am I going to analyze it? My Excel spreadsheet isn't going to handle this. Now we actually have hope of using that clarity to actually get some interesting and relevant information that, as we say in the title of the podcast, is actionable. And that's what's exciting to me, is getting to actionable data for lots of different roles. I mean, we can have a whole different conversation about how this leads to actionable data for test engineers, for example. But I agree that program managers have been left out in a lot of ways of the conversation about what to do with information that comes out of the DevSecOps pipeline. So I'm really glad that you guys are working on this, and look forward to some of our other teams working together with you, because we all have different pieces that we know about in relationship to the DevSecOps and the digital engineering and all that kind of stuff. So I want to thank you for joining us and talking with us today. This has been a lovely conversation for me. As people can probably tell, I have some passion for these things, and I have passions for many things. That's why I love doing the interviews. But I do want to remind our audience that we will have lots of links in this transcript to resources that we mentioned and that are related. There is a blog post coming out on this topic, so you'll want to look for that. And we want to remind you, the audience, that you should be able to find this anywhere that you get your podcast. If you like SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google, and of course, my favorite, the SEI's YouTube channel. So please feel free to see us there or wherever you want to get your podcast. And I want to thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. This copyrighted work is made available through the Software Engineering Institute, a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. For more information about the SEI and this work, please visit www.sei.cmu.edu. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.